Well, thanks everyone for coming along tonight. We're really excited to tell you tonight about the Eriskay Gansey. This is part of the Scottish Fisheries Museum current event in the herring. So we're really excited about this project, and we're currently creating the Gansey database so that we can share the collections held at the museum with you all. As well as various herring patterns and online tutorials and different online events such as this. So this evening we have such an exciting part of the Gansey story to tell you. So Matthew Topsfield is an active member of the knitting community in the Isle of Uist in the Outer Hebrides. He runs the Uist Yarn Studio, amongst other things, and has kindly offered to present tonight on the Eriskay Gansey. So thanks so much, Matt. I'll just stop my screen share and ask you to share the presentation with the group.
Okay, I'll try and share my screen now. Okay,
So,
can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Super. Well, thank you very much, Carolyn, and I was really delighted to be asked to speak to you all about the Eriskay Gansey. So my name's Matt Topsfield. I've been a lifelong knitter.
No, I don't want to lose it.
My grandmother taught me to knit at her knee when I was about 4 or 5 years old, and I've been knitting my whole life. So that's almost 4 decades of knitting, and I've been expanding my interest in wool, so I now do a little bit of weaving and a little bit of spinning.
Sorry to interrupt, but some people haven't got their mics. There's a lot of interference.
And to bring it back to that, that sort of idea of like things that are more hand finished and
It's interesting that you're venturing into women's wear, because I keep hearing that menswear as a category is...
I can hear another conversation going on in the background. Okay, we seem to be okay now. So in common with a lot of people that live on island communities, I have several strings to my bow. I manage a community centre on the island of Gansey in the Uist. I have a small yarn studio where I sell some of my own work from. I do little bits of ecology survey work on a freelance basis. Very common with a lot of island folk. You make ends meet by doing lots of little bits and pieces. So tonight I'm going to talk to you about the Eriskay Gansey, which will be my primary focus. But I don't know, there's probably a wide range of experience and knowledge here tonight. So I'm going to just run through some of the basics as well, just to make sure everyone's on the same page and at the same starting point. So I'll talk a little bit about just what ganseys are, particularly with a focus on their anatomy, how they're structured, how they're constructed, and a bit of a classification in my thinking on how I classify them in my mind. We'll talk about a couple of myths about ganseys. We'll focus very much on the Eriskay Gansey patterns and motifs. And then I'll talk a little bit about ganseys as modern garments, and then a bit about the Eriskay herring pattern for the shoal. So what is a gansey? Well, a basic definition is that it's a close-fitting sweater. They're worked as a working garment, traditionally, knitted in the round and usually using a worsted spun wool. So there's a few things in there to pick out. So they're close-fitting. They usually have very little ease to them at all, so they're worn close to the body. These are for practical reasons. If you're working in the garment, you don't want lots of flaps and folds of fabric getting in the way. Also, if it's close-fitting, it's trapping the warm air right next to your body and keeping you warm. Knitted in the round, this really is the way that a lot of knitting would have been done traditionally. It's only relatively recently, with the advent of kind of fashion patterns, that knitted garments would have been knitted in flat panels and then sewn together, and that's really kind of an influence from a more kind of like a seamstress kind of direction in terms of design patterns that are written for flat panels. That's come from more of a kind of a fabric kind of design route rather than traditional knitting techniques. So knitting in the round in a seamless way. And it's typically from a worsted spun wool. So there are two main ways of producing a woolen yarn. One is worsted spun, so all of the fibres from the fleece are combed in the same direction and then spun up so that all the fibres are lying parallel. That tends to result in less air being inside the yarn, and it's generally a smoother yarn. It's usually more hard wearing. Woolen spun, the fibres are carded, so they lie in lots of different directions, and they're spun in a way that traps more air into the yarn, so they tend to be lighter and they trap more air and tend to be warmer, but they are more likely to wear and to pill and not to be quite so robust and hard wearing. And traditionally a Gansey sweater would be made by the female relations of the wearer, and they're particularly linked to the herring fishery ports around the country. So they were really worn by fishermen on boats as workwear to keep them warm and dry and comfortable when they're out working. And they'd be made at home by the female relations, a mother, a sister, maybe a sweetheart, a fiancé or something like that. So a proper kind of homemade industry. And a Gansey will offer many benefits to the fisherman whilst he's at sea. And they're really kind of focused around the comfort of the wearer. So the Gansey provides weatherproofing and waterproofing to him whilst he's out at sea and working on the boats. So the way that the fabric is knitted helps to keep the wind out. Also, it helps to shed the water, and I'll talk more about that. Also, it keeps them warm. So the patterning that is worked onto the Gansey increases the capacity for the fabric to trap air next to the body. So that helps to keep the wearer warm. Also longevity, they were kind of knit in a way that allows them to be repaired and recycled quite easily. So the way that the sleeves are knit from the top down to the cuff means that they could be picked back if they wear around the cuff and the lower part. So you can pick it back to pick up the stitches and re-knit the lower part of the cuff if you need to. And also we should remember, whilst this is a working garment, Ganseys also had a role as a formal garment as well. And most fishermen would have a Sunday best Gansey that they would wear for formal occasions. And in fishing communities and places where Ganseys were made and worn regularly, a smart Sunday best Gansey would be considered to be as smart and appropriate for a formal occasion as a suit would be. So a lot of fishermen would be wearing their best Ganseys to church and to weddings and formal occasions as well. So whilst they are a working garment, they would have been worn for best as well. This is a map which is a bit pixelated. I've pulled this from another talk that I usually give about the Northeast Atlantic knitting traditions. But this is just really to point out the context for where Eriskay lies. So Eriskay is in the Outer Hebrides, the Western Isles, and it's kind of down towards the southern tip between South Uist and Eriskay. The context is also interesting in terms of the Gansey knitting traditions and where Ganseys were knit, in that it relates to the herring fishery, as I said before. And herring have a spawning run. So in late spring, early summer, the herring will start to come in from the Atlantic and move their way down into the North Sea, round the north of Scotland, and work their way down the North Sea. And the spawning run kind of moves through the season. So it's quite a long season that the herring are running on their spawning run, and a long season of opportunity for the fishermen to be catching them. And they will work their way down, all the way down the North Sea towards the Netherlands, which had a great herring fishery tradition as well. And some populations would go into the Baltic to spawn as well. So the run makes its way from the Atlantic around the north of Scotland and down the east coast and into the North Sea. So a Gansey knitting tradition isn't uniquely Scottish or unique to the UK. There are Gansey traditions further afield as well, and there are a couple of great books on the Gansey knitting patterns from the Netherlands which are available, which are well worth getting. Within the Western Isles, I'm just picking out Eriskay's right at the bottom there, just below South Uist, north of Barra, and it's blown up there on the right, and it's quite a small island. It's only about 3 miles by 2, so it's not very big at all. And it was only very recently joined by causeway to the rest of the islands. So the Uist run from Eriskay to Bernary in the north. These are 6 or 7 islands that are all connected by causeway, so you can drive across the causeways no matter what the state of tide. Prior to that, you had to either wait for low tide and make your way across the sand flat. There we go. Unmute. So people would have got around by boat, and very much, you know, these are islands of a seafaring tradition. There are some differences culturally between the southern Outer Hebrides, so that's the Uists, and then the northern parts of these islands, so Harris and Lewis. Generally, the Uist has better, more fertile ground, so people tended to do a lot more farming, crofting activity, and fishing was more of a supplementary activity, whereas Harris is more mountainous and Lewis is very much moorland. So they relied much more on fishing than we did in the Uists, and they tended to be regarded as fishermen who did a bit of farming, whereas on Uist they were farmers that did a bit of fishing. It was the other way around. So here's just a couple of images. So you can see here, this is the herring gutters gutting the herring where they've been landed in Stornoway. So Stornoway would have been quite a major port for landing the herring catch. And this would have been quite early in the spawning run, early in the year, maybe sort of around early May, that the herring would be sort of caught and landed up around here. So the women are working away, they're gutting the fish, which were then packed and salted in barrels to preserve them and to allow them to be transported around. And you can see, although Stornoway wasn't one of the biggest ports for landing herring, you can just see from the number of barrels there, you know, it would have been quite an important industry for the town at that time. And Stornoway wasn't the only place in the Outer Hebrides that herring would have been landed, so they would have been landed in ports from Castle Bay and Barra up into South Uist at a place called Loch Skippert. This is now a very remote part of the island. It's on the east coast of South Uist, about halfway down the coast. This pier now is derelict. The walls holding back the road are kind of crumbling now. But you can see there again barrels lying on the pier, which will have been used for packing herring. I don't know whether or not the boat here is, you know, would have been used for transporting herring. It looks to me like this might be a pleasure vessel. And particularly when you look at the ladies standing on the quayside, they're wearing fine hats and lovely dresses and everybody looks quite smart. So this might well have been a steamer bringing passengers for pleasure rather than a freight vessel. But it looks nothing like this today, I can tell you. Right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the anatomy of a gansey itself. They are fairly simple garments with relatively little shaping to them. So you're not shaping for the armholes or shaping for fit. They are close fitting to the body and they're relying on the natural stretch and capacity for a knitted woolen fabric to fit the body. I've labelled the parts here because it's just useful to clarify some of the terminology before we go on. So starting at the bottom is the welt. People normally think of this as the ribbing band at the bottom, but there are different ways of working the welt. Ribbing might be one of them. And because we're working in the round, we're working our way up the garment, through the body. And when I say body, I think of this as kind of the torso, the lower part of the body of the garment, below the armhole. When you start reaching the armhole, you work a gusset under the arm. Because it's close fitting and you have very little ease in the garment, traditionally of a gansey, a gusset would be worked just to allow a bit more freedom of movement underneath the arms, particularly if you're hauling in herring nets or pulling on ropes, raising sails. You know, you don't want too much strain happening underneath the armhole there, so a gusset just helps give you that bit of freedom and ease of movement. Above that is the yoke, which is the upper part of the body across the chest and the shoulders. An allowance is then left for the neck opening and shoulders are joined on either side. The sleeves are then picked up around the armhole, you pick up the stitches and work the sleeve from the top down to the cuff on both sides, and then finally around the neck opening, the stitches will be picked up to work a collar treatment of some sort. So this is kind of showing the direction of working, so starting at the bottom with the welt. You might either work a ribbing band, which is worked in the round, so that's the arrows on the left-hand side of this little diagram. You might also work a welt flap, which is worked backwards and forwards for a couple of inches. You'll do that for both front and back, and then you'll join in the round. So you'll have a flap, usually of garter stitch at the bottom, front and back, with a little slit at the side at the bottom. So it's not close fitting and pulling in at the bottom like a ribbing band would. You're then working in the round in the body, so the solid arrows are the front side that you can see, and the dotted arrows are working in the round the back on the other side of the garment. When you get to the, say, a couple of inches before the base of the armhole, you start working your gusset, and the gusset is worked half of the length with the body, and then the other half is worked when you start working the sleeve. So it's worked half and half, and the live stitches are just kept on a holder for the gusset whilst you work the yoke. And the yoke is then worked back and forth because you're dividing. So it's not like when you're working, say, a traditional fair isle garment and you're working in the round and putting a steek in so you can just keep working the colour work in the round. With the Gansey, you'll tend to separate the front and the back and work the front and the back of the yoke across the chest and the shoulders, backwards and forwards, rather than in the round. And you're then joining at the shoulder. And then likewise, the sleeves are worked in the round, so each sleeve you're picking up the live stitches around the armhole, including those live stitches from the gusset that you've put on the holder when you've worked the body, and you work then down the sleeve. The collar's generally worked in the round depending on what kind of collar treatment you're having, but there is one type of collar that you'd work it back and forth, and I'll talk about collars in a little while. The garments are usually worked on traditionally long DPNs. So here I've got, you can't see that very well, a long 40 centimetre double pointed needle, and you'll use a set of these. Most ganseys you'll need a set of 5, so you'll hold the stitches on 4 needles and you'll be working with a 5th. And that works perfectly fine. Usually, I mean, there are a couple of tricky stages. When you first get going, it's hard to know where to put the needles, and then when you get to the point where you're separating for the yoke, it can get a bit hard to handle sometimes too. So if you want to knit a Gansey and you want to use a circular needle, then by all means don't be put off by the purists that say you must use a DPN. If you're more comfortable working on circular needles, then by all means do that. The tension that we usually aim for these days is about 7 stitches to the inch. That's about 28 to 10 centimetres, so it's a fairly dense fabric. And the yarn that's used, as I said, is a worsted spun yarn traditionally, and that's usually in a 5-ply weight. For those of you outside the UK, that's approximately a sport weight yarn. And the one thing I haven't shown on the diagrams is that there's usually a false seam that's included down the side of the body, and then that usually continues down on the underside of the arm, the sleeve as well. So you work 1 or 2 purl stitches down the side to create a false seam, and this kind of helps keep track of where you are in your pattern, and is also a nice decorative finish. I find as well, when you're working in the rounds, having a little purl stitch at the beginning or end of the transition between needles helps to hide any slackness that you might get between changing needles. So it's important to pull the yarn tight for the first couple of stitches when you're working onto a new needle, but that little false seam helps to hide any slackness you might get in the yarn there. So here you can see just a little bit of the gusset. So here the main photograph is showing the gusset that I've worked into a Gansey. Now this Gansey is unusual in that I haven't just worked a single side seam on the side of the body and under the arm, but it's actually got a triple side seam, and I've worked the gusset into the knit stitches that form the kind of 2 ribs there, so you end up with this kind of leaf shape. I've also done something a bit odd in that I've worked the gusset quite long in the bottom part on the body and shorter in the arm. But the little insect photo on the top right shows you one that I'm working on at the moment, which is more of a traditional way the gusset is worked. So I've got the pearl stitch there running down from the body, and the gusset is worked into that, so it forms a little diamond shape. So that's more usual for the gusset to be worked. But you can get quite decorative and inventive with the gussets. And the blue arrows show the direction that you're working in generally. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of a rough classification, and this is just how I tend to think of ganseys in my mind, how they're broadly classified. So I think about the way that the patterns are arranged and how much of the body they are covering. Likewise for the sleeves, the extent and arrangement of patterning on those. And then there are some subsidiary kind of features that I think about in terms of how the welt has been treated, the shoulder as well, and then how the collar's finished off. So I'll just run through some of these features. So in terms of the patterning on the body, we don't see them very often in collections, and I know that the collection that the museum have online at the moment has one Gansey that is just plain throughout. And you don't tend to see these very often, certainly not in historic photographs or collections. That's not to say that Ganseys weren't worked plain, and I'll talk about that again a bit later on. So you can find Ganseys that were worked just plain with no patterning on the bodies. But more often than not, we do see Ganseys with elaborate patterning on them, and this patterning can take different forms. So the patterning can cover all of the body. Sorry, I'm not much of a draftsman. These are little scribbled sketches, but they give the idea. So the patterning might be arranged in vertical columns, running the full length of the body, and you'll have motifs placed within those patterns, within those columns in the overall pattern, which will be repeating throughout those columns. And you'll have some kind of device that will be separating them, whether it's a cable or a seeded rib or something like that. There'll be some kind of seeding or moss stitch or something that will separate out those columns. So you might have, as I said, they're vertical patterning. You might also have horizontal bands of patterning instead, where the patterns run across the body in kind of rings around the body. So vertical and horizontal patterning, but the concept is very similar in that you've got a repeating motif running across the body, and they'll be separated in some way, maybe with lines of garter stitch or something like that. And then you might have kind of an overall pattern, which doesn't really kind of fit into a column or a band and is more just of an overall repeating pattern across the body. So for full body patterns, there's kind of, those are the four main types I tend to think of. And then we might have half patterning, so only half of the body is patterned. And generally this will be the upper part, the yoke, because that's the part where the fisherman will have mostly needed the protection, the extra warmth. So it's this patterning, this knits and pearls and cables and ribs that increase the thickness of the fabric and trap more air and keep you warmer. So concentrating that up on the yoke is the part that would have been more exposed. So traditionally fishermen would have worn quite high-waisted trousers, and the Gansey would have been tucked into the trousers. So I think maybe the knitters thought there probably wasn't much point patterning the bottom part of the Gansey on the lower part of the body there, because it would have been hidden from sight, tucked inside the trousers. So why bother ornamenting it if it's not going to be seen? Also, you've got that extra layer of trouser fabric insulating you. So it's the more exposed upper part of the body on the yoke that needed the patterning and the extra warmth. So again, this might be configured in vertical arrangements, in columns, or it might be in horizontal bands, but just across that top half of the body. And again, an overall pattern that just doesn't fit into columns or bands, but is an overall pattern, but just covering the top half of the body. And then this is just an example of some of the motifs that are fitting within vertical columns on a Gansey body. So you can see we've got variations on diamonds, knit in moss stitch. We've got some crosses there, which in Eriskay they represent starfish, but they might be termed other things elsewhere. And then we've got kind of a false cable, which is a slip over pattern. So you're passing over a yarn over a couple of knit stitches to create kind of a false cable, and then columns of seeding rib. The pattern on the far left is something that in Eriskay ganseys we call harbour steps, but elsewhere I've seen referred to as the ladder. Talking about the body of Eriskay ganseys specifically, they combine elements of kind of all of these typologies really. So you'll find with an Eriskay gansey, the lower part of the body is arranged in vertical columns with repeating motifs running through the columns separated by these devices. But when you get to the part of the gansey where you're working the gusset to divide the body and the yoke, you will have a band of a diamond motif, which we call fishing net. It does look like kind of a fishing net pattern, and that will run across to divide off the body from the yoke. And then the yoke itself takes on a very blocky form, so it doesn't really fit into columns or bands, but it's more blocks that are divided up vertically and horizontally, usually with larger motifs, more striking and decorative motifs in the upper part of the body. So the arrangement of the patterns in an Eriskay gansey is much more complex and doesn't fit into those simpler categories that I've kind of described. Likewise for the sleeves, you might find ganseys that have quite plain sleeves, so they could very well have an ornamented body that is richly patterned, but the sleeves are just plain. I know when I get to the end of a big project, you know, you put the body together and, oh, you know, you just want to get through the sleeves as quick as you can. So sometimes you don't want to have too much pattern on them. But at the other end of the extreme, you might have a fully patterned sleeve that is patterned for its full length and all the way around the sleeve. That might be probably more often than not vertically arranged. I haven't seen any or any examples where the full length of the sleeve is patterned in horizontal bands, kind of rings around the sleeve, but they might well be out there. Or more commonly, you will find just half of the sleeve that is patterned, and this would normally be the top half of the sleeve. So that again could be arranged vertically or horizontally in bands. There's a really good practical reason for doing this with the upper half of the sleeve only patterned. Because the fishermen are working quite hard, the sleeves themselves, actually I should say about the sleeves won't usually work to a full length down to the wrist either, as you would normally in a sweater these days. Because they're a working garment and the fishermen are putting their hands into the water and, you know, nets and everything, and they're going to get wet and slimy, the sleeves would be worked shorter, maybe like a 3/4 length sleeve. So then the bottom of the sleeve would be less likely to get wet and then less likely to chafe, you know, to chafe the fisherman when it's wet and cold. So a shorter sleeve. But if the bottom part of that sleeve is left unpatterned and quite plain, it's very easy if the sleeve does start to wear out and to unravel through use and wear and tear. It's much easier then just to you know, rip it back and to pick up the stitches from that plain knit part. You just take it back to you know, a good sound row of stitches, pick it up, and then you can re-knit the lower portion of that sleeve. And there are lots of examples of historic ganseys where we can see evidence of re-knitting of the lower part of the sleeves where the cuffs have become worn. And then there are a few examples where you'll find patterning on the lower part of the sleeve and not on the upper part. There are a couple of examples of that. And this would seem kind of counterintuitive to what I've just said about reworking the sleeves where they're worn most. But I think in these examples, these are probably more likely to be Sunday best ganseys that aren't being worn as workwear. So these are probably more knit with the intention of being a Sunday best gansey and a formal wear rather than an everyday working garment. And then the sleeves of Eriskay ganseys are what I think they fall into a half sleeve category, but just to be different again, they're not quite fitting into the categorization, in that the patterning that is on the Eriskay gansey sleeve does run the full length of the sleeve, but only for half of its diameter. So it's the upper or outer half of the sleeve that you can see when you're wearing it normally that is patterned, but the underside of the sleeve, where it's less obvious and not seen so much, is usually plain. And I think this is a bit of a compromise again between having that rich ornamentation on the Eriskay gansey, but trying to save a bit of time by not working, you know, making life too hard for yourself by working a lot of ornamentation somewhere it's not going to be seen. So again, it's kind of a unique arrangement of patterning and motifs on the sleeve. And you usually find that the motifs that occur on the sleeves of the ganseys are usually picked up from motifs that have already been used in the body. So you've got some continuity within the garment. you wouldn't normally see novel motifs included into a sleeve. It's usually a riff on what you've done on the body. And then the subsidiary elements, I've already mentioned the welt. That might be worked as a ribbing band on the bottom, or you might work it as a garter stitch welt flap. So you'll knit 2 welt flaps backwards and forwards, maybe on straight needles, and then you'll join them both to work in the round. So you'll have these 2 separate flaps, front and back. And if you want a more modern garment that's easier to wear and to move in, a bit loose around the bottom, then that's a good option to go for. Shoulder treatments can vary, and they can vary regionally, and they can just vary based on choice. So the images here that I'm showing on the left hand side, the one at the top is kind of the rig and fur pattern, and these are successive bands of garter stitch. And this is quite characteristic, particularly from around sort of northeast England, but it does occur elsewhere. And this is just a nice way of finishing off the shoulder, particularly if you're then using a 3-needle bind off to join the 2 shoulders together with the join showing on the outside, as in this example. You can join the shoulder on the ins with the seam on the inside as well, but I think it's quite nice to see the join on the outside as a decorative feature. The middle picture is this slip over stitch, which I've shown before in the kind of false cable, the vertical device. But if you just work it close together, you can create quite a nice pattern on the shoulder. So you'll work that for a few rows and then do a join. Again, either 3-needle bind off or grafting, whatever way you want to join. Something we also see quite commonly with Eriskay ganseys is at the bottom here on the left, that's the fishing net pattern that you use to divide the body from the yoke as a device. So the fishing net, you can also repeat that on the shoulder, just to provide a decorative element on the shoulder before you join the front and back as well. And then one other way, if you want to go overboard with your shoulder treatment, is to work a perpendicular band of knitting from the edge of where the collar will be. And you can do this in various ways. You could do it with one of your motifs that you're going to run down the sleeve, or in this case, with the picture on the right, with a pair of cables. And you just pick up live stitches from the front and the back as you're working each row, and incorporating them into the band that you start knitting. And that's a really nice way, because it really kind of gives you a nice flow from the collar across the top of the shoulder and down the sleeve, and that can work really effectively. And in terms of colours themselves, again, sorry about my draftsmanship, there's various ways of treating them. The ones that we see most commonly in particularly Eriskay ganseys is the top centre, which is a short stand-up collar, which might be a couple of inches in height. It's a ribbon collar, but it'll be fixed with a couple of buttons. So there'll be a little garter stitch tab and a couple of buttons to fix it, so it's actually open. So that collar would not be worked in the round. That would be worked backwards and forwards on the needles, because it would need to open to fix those buttons. And that just helps avoid too much stretching as you're pulling the gansey on over your head. It's avoiding stretching the neck hole too much. Working clockwise, bottom right, you might have a kind of polo style neck on the gansey. This might be just a single layer of fabric as a kind of more like a turtleneck, or it might be much longer and it folds back on itself like a polo neck to give you extra warmth around the neck. So these kind of longer kind of polo neck, turtleneck type collars were probably most common in most ganseys knit in other parts of Scotland, from what I can see, as opposed to the short button collar that is very common on the Eriskay ganseys. And then it's really more of a more recent modern innovation is kind of having more of a round or crew neck type finish to the collar, particularly having a bit of a drop at the front so that the neckline isn't sitting too close up to the throat. So traditionally, all of the necklines on the ganseys were just knitted straight, so there was no kind of shaping to the neck around the neck before you join the shoulders. It was straight across. And that results in a neck that sits very close up around the throat, which is great for keeping the weather and the water out. But if you want to wear it as a comfortable everyday garment these days, then something that's a bit more shaped around the neck will be much more comfortable. I'm hopefully not going to be too controversial with some of this. There's usually quite a lot of myths that go around about ganseys and how they worked and the traditions around them. So I'm just going to try and debunk some of these. So there's a common conception that the yarn used for knitting ganseys is oiled to provide waterproofing. So there are different types of oil, and there might have been some waterproofing properties when crofters would have been spinning their own yarn at home. If they're spinning in the grease from the fleece with fibre that hasn't been washed, there might be some waterproofing properties from that. But with the advent of commercial spinning of yarns, yarns that are spun on big machinery, scouring became very important, removing that lanolin, that grease from the yarn, and the dirt as well, to make sure that the yarn could be spun up efficiently without gumming up the machine with all the grease and lanolin. So fleece is typically now washed to remove all of that, and then before it goes through the process of spinning, it is then having a oil added to it. But this is quite a light mineral oil, and the purpose of it is just to lubricate it through the machinery rather than to provide any kind of waterproofing. And it is a very light oil. So when the finished yarn is washed at the end of the process, the oil does all wash out. As I say, if a crofter was hand spinning their own yarn in the grease, by the time you've spun that yarn quite tightly, some of the lanolin will be trapped inside. So no matter how much you wash that yarn, it'd be very hard to remove all of that lanolin from a hand spun yarn spun in the grease. But certainly from a modern day mill spun yarn, the oil would all wash out. So it doesn't offer any waterproofing. What does offer the water and weatherproofing to a Gansey yarn is that it's a worsted spun yarn. So as I mentioned before, this is all fibres lying parallel, close together. So they have less air spaces within them. So that prevents so much wind getting through, and also less water getting through because there's less air spaces between the fibres. Also, a Gansey yarn tends to be twisted more tightly than other types of knitting yarn. So there's a much more tighter twist. And this again reduces the air spaces between the fibres, packing those fibres closer together. So worsted spun yarn with a tight twist is helping to keep the wind and the water out. And then the other aspect is that we're knitting a very dense fabric. So a 5-ply Gansey yarn is typically not that different to a DK weight yarn, but you're knitting it, well, I knit to get 7 stitches to the inch on a 3mm needle, which is much smaller than you would knit a DK yarn with typically. So you're getting quite a dense tension. The fabric is very dense. The stitches are close together with little gaps, with very few gaps between them. So if you hold up a Gansey garment to the light, you can't see much light coming through it between the strands of yarn in the stitches. So a dense fabric knit on small needles, again, that keeps the weather out and the wind and the water out. Some people think that individual knitters and individual towns had unique patterns and motifs, and by this I mean truly unique patterns that were unique to them. With the herring industry, there was a lot of mobility in the workforce. This is the fishermen who would have followed the herring spawning run around the coast. So the fishermen would have travelled quite widely, been at sea for quite a long time to catch the herring, and they would have been moving around following the herring. So they were mobile. So they would have been wearing their ganseys, calling in at other ports around the country where the women folk, the knitters, would have seen the ganseys they're wearing. But also the herring girls as well. Many of those would have travelled to follow the fleet and to earn their money gutting herring all around the coast of Scotland and the UK. So the workforce itself was moving, so they would have been taking their traditions with them. So there's a lot of mixing of ideas and traditions and cultures with that mobility of the workforce. So it'd be quite hard for an individual knitter or town to develop their own truly unique pattern or motif that isn't replicated by anybody else anywhere. I think what we do see is general trends and kind of flavours in terms of the overall kind of general patterning styles that we see. There might be a preference for certain motifs in certain areas, but those motifs might be worked everywhere else in the UK or by all of your neighbouring ports. So I think there are very few places where you find truly unique individual to one person or one place. Having said that, when you do start looking at ganseys in very fine detail, it does start to become possible to pick out features of an individual knitter in the particular ways that they do things, or in the way that they arrange things, or they knit a particular pattern. You can start to pick out those fine details of individual knitters. But again, those things might not be unique to them, but in their totality, you might be able to deduce works that are common to a particular knitter. The other thing that people say is that the ganseys were knit with unique patterns or combinations of patterns, or even initials knitted into them, so that if the men were lost at sea, their bodies could be identified. But it's unfortunate fact that most fishermen that were lost at sea, their bodies were never recovered. So that wouldn't have been a great deal of use. And I think particularly when you're finding initials that are knitted into part of the body of the gansey, that it has a very practical role in that if you're working on the boat and you get hot and you take off your gansey, because a lot of them are knit in the same kind of navy yarn, it's much easier to find which is your gansey if it's got your initials on it. So like having a little name tag when you go to school in the back of your jumper. Also, people tend to think of ganseys as being beautifully ornamented and patterned garments. And I think we just need to be wary about not being seduced into the idea that all ganseys were beautifully patterned. Most of the photographs we see late 19th, early 20th century, we should bear in mind that photography was still, an expensive thing. You didn't have, cameras on your phone and snapping shots here and there. You paid quite a lot of money to take a single photograph. So you'd normally be staging those photographs. And of course, with that staging, people would usually be putting on their Sunday best because they've had time to prepare and get their best garments out, and the whole staging process. So just be wary that if we're seeing photos of ganseys being worn, it might be a staged photograph and not people wearing their everyday working gansey. And also, because these were working garments, they had a lot of rough treatment. They would have got wet, they would have been worn, they would have got very dirty. So the garments that were actually everyday working garments probably never were in a condition that would ever survive and be passed down, whereas the Sunday best gansey that had been looked after very well would have been passed down. So the everyday working garments rarely survive. So we just need to be careful not to assume that all ganseys were beautifully ornamented and patterned. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the specific features of the Eriskay ganseys now. Just briefly on the history, ganseys have always been worked here in the Outer Hebrides and on Eriskay. I think it's hard to deduce much now because there are so few of the original gansey knitters left. And I think we're kind of at that point where the opportunity to collect a lot of that knowledge and information is really past us now. So many of the original knitters are lost. I think there's only a couple of the original sort of gansey knitters from the mid to late 20th century left with us now. Most of them aren't knitting anymore. But there was a lot of work done about 50 years ago, well actually in 1979, the cooperative on Eriskay was set up to help with the economic vibrancy of the island of Eriskay. And part of that was selling Eriskay ganseys. So throughout the 80s, that was increasingly popular, and the knitters were quite successful selling their ganseys through the cooperative. They were sending ganseys to America and to London, as well as being commissioned by visitors who came here to commission a gansey for them. So they were earning money by directly selling their ganseys with no middlemen. So the cooperative really helped, but it was only ever a very small supplemental part of their income on Eriskay. Knitting was never kind of a mainstay of the income as it would have been, say, in Shetland or Faroe Isle. First and foremost, they were fisher people, farmers, crofters, and knitting would have just been a very small supplementary part of their income. And even with the advent of the cooperative, it was very hard to make any serious money from it, because these are hand knit garments that take a lot of time, and recouping your time for what people are willing to pay for the garment is very difficult. There are some special features about the Eriskay ganseys. So in terms of yarn selection, as I've said, most ganseys are knit with a 5-ply worsted spun yarn. What we tend to see in a lot of historic photographs is a lot of the ganseys seem to be quite dark, so probably indigo dyed. But certainly most, if not all, of the historic Eriskay ganseys that I've seen are generally knit in a natural coloured cream or white yarn that's not dyed. And I think the reason for this is probably because they are so heavily ornamented. The white yarn shows off that patterning and those motifs to the best advantage. With a dark yarn, the pattern relief doesn't stand out so well as it does with a lighter shade. So I think the Eriskay knitters probably chose the natural cream or white yarn for that reason, to show off the pattern, in a similar way that Aran sweaters from Ireland are knit in a cream yarn, because that shows off best the rich patterning. That's not to say that Eriskays aren't now knit in a whole wide range of colours. And then I'll just talk about their overall construction and the pattern arrangement, although I've touched on these already. So with pretty much all of the Eriskay ganseys that I've seen, they all have a ribbing welt at the bottom. This might be a 1x1 rib or a 2x2. I think for an Eriskay gansey, because they are so heavily patterned and richly ornamented, for my preference, if I'm knitting them, I like to work a 1x1, a knit 1 purl 1 rib, just because that fits better with the rich ornamentation than a 2x2, although it does take longer. As I've said, we've got the breaking up of the body, the columns in the body, the fishing net, and then the blocks on top, the half pattern sleeves. And then, as I said, most of the collar treatments on traditional Eriskay ganseys, older Eriskay ganseys, was the short buttoned collar, and I've not seen much, if any, variation from that. Modern knitters will do a range of neck styles to suit what the wearer would want, but the short button collar is certainly most common in historic Eriskay ganseys. And then I'll just run through some of the motifs, because we do see some motifs that are quite much more prevalent in the Eriskay ganseys than in other gansey traditions from elsewhere. The thing that comes home to me about this is that a lot of the motifs used in Eriskay ganseys are much more figurative. They're actually representing something rather than being more of an abstract motif. They're not an abstraction of a zigzag or a line, and yes, that zigzag represents waves, or that line represents marriage in an abstract way. They are figurative, so they're showing actual things, and you can kind of work out what they are in most cases. So here, for example, is the Tree of Life, and I know this occurs elsewhere in other ganseys from other areas, but it's very much a very common feature, particularly on the yoke of the Eriskay gansey on the upper part. So the Tree of Life, and there's another variation of the Tree of Life that is also worked, I'll show you later. But this is very common. This is kind of the typical 7-branch Tree of Life, but the number of branches can vary, so depending on the space you've got to fit it into. Anchors here, they don't show up so well on the photographs, but the little charts, there's large and small anchors. Again, these are showing what they're representing. They're very figurative. Starfish. You do get different species of starfish with different numbers of arms, so not all starfish have 5 arms. So there are some starfish that have, 8 or 10 or 12 arms, or many more. So the large starfish on the left-hand side is quite similar to the Nordic kind of snowflake pattern. That's termed the starfish in Eriskay, and again, that's a large pattern that appears on the yoke typically. But there are smaller kind of starfish motifs which are a little bit more abstract, so it's these 4-armed crosses. So there's a large one top right, and then smaller ones which are just kind of like a little saltire kind of cross, which are a little bit more abstracted, but these are all kind of representations of starfish that appear on Eriskay ganseys. I've mentioned the fishing net a few times, either as a device to separate the body from the yoke or as a shoulder treatment. And the fishing net itself can vary quite a lot. So at the bottom, you've just got 1 repeat of the diamond. It's a 1 diamond fishing net. The one above it is 1.5. You might then add another half to make it a full 2 diamond fishing net. So just fitting it into the space that you have available. Typically the fishing net is worked across the part of the body where you're working the gusset increases. So if you're working a 20 a gusset that's 20 stitches wide. That would be 20 rows of knitting to create that gusset. And the 1.5 diamond fishing net device on the top there fits in very nicely into that space whilst you're working that gusset. So that's what we see fairly often. And then these are some motifs which we see again very commonly in Eriskay ganseys. Particularly, I always include these in every Gansey Eriskay Gansey that I make. This is the Harbour steps on the left, which you've seen before, and then the pennant or flag on the right-hand side. And I find that these are really nice patterns just to put at the edge of the body or at the edge of the yoke around the armhole, just to define the edge of the garment. So here's a fully worked up Gansey. This is my own Gansey, the one I'm wearing just now. And you can see all of these devices and motifs being employed in various ways. The large snowflake or starfish, the tree of life, and anchors. Anchors large on the top, and there are small ones on the bottom, along with some of the more abstract motifs, diamonds and zigzags representing the waves. A question that comes up so often is, well, why are the Eriskay ganseys so distinctive? Why are they so heavily ornamented and elaborate? And when you look at this, they are very, very ornamented. And I think, again, because we've lost so many of the original knitters and their origin is so far back, it's very hard to tell exactly where they came from and why they are so ornamented. I think there's a little bit of it, might be a bit of the show off. So there might have been a particularly talented knitter or group of knitters who were quite proud of their work, and they worked very ornamented designs to show their skill. And certainly these are trends that we've seen in other parts of Scotland, with some of the elaborate skills displayed in Fair Isle and Shetland with their colour work and their lace work. So there might be a little bit of demonstrating their skill. I don't think they'd have been doing this for everyday working ganseys, certainly, because you wouldn't want to put so much work into a working garment that it's going to have rough treatment. So these would probably have been Sunday best garments mostly, and if they're knitting a Gansey for everyday workwear, they would have gone for a much plainer design. So I think the Eriskay is an example of the best of Sunday best. Also, I have read that there was a knitter who was particularly adept at designing and working with patterns. Unfortunately, anybody who had any connections with her is long gone, so it's hard to find out more about that. And it's a real shame because, I mean, we were planning an Eriskay, a Uist Gansey exhibition here on the Uist this year, which was postponed due to coronavirus. And I was keen to use that as a platform to try and find out a bit more about the history from anybody that still had some kind of living memory or second-hand memories about it. So we're hoping still to do that next year and gather more information. So this just highlights the importance of a project like Knitting the Herring and gathering this information whilst we have it. And there are still some knitters around who might have memories of the traditions and where they came from. And just looking at ganseys in the modern world and how they can be interpreted as modern fashion wear. So there's a few tips that I'd give you if you're making a Gansey for modern day wear. The first one would be around ease. So traditionally they were knit to have little or no ease at all, very tight fitting. But if you want a more comfortable modern garment that's going to be easier to wear, then I'd certainly say add a few inches so that it fits you much more loosely and you're more comfortable in it and not feeling like you're in a straight jacket. And you might want to think about the details of the styling. So maybe you want to work a welt flap instead of a ribbing band at the bottom, or think about what type of collar treatment you want. Do you want it a bit looser? Do you want to work it with a V-neck maybe? Or as one lady has done here in the US, she's knit an Eriskay cardigan. So, she's taken the Eriskay concept and made a completely non-traditional kind of garment from it, but it looks fantastic. Think about the tension that you're knitting to, or the gauge that you're knitting to. So maybe you want a garment that has a little bit more of a drape and is less of a dense fabric. So maybe work with some tension swatches, trying different needle sizes just to find a drape that you like that will fit you better maybe. But do bear in mind that if you're making the tension too loose, then you are going to lose some of that detail of the stitch relief, because the stitches aren't going to be sitting so proud on the surface of the fabric. But think about maybe playing around with tension. And then yarn selection. I mean, there's a huge selection of yarns out there now. You can choose a wide variety of colours now of Gansey yarns that are available from some of the modern suppliers. But you might also want to think about using a different type of yarn. So if you want to expand your choices, then maybe look at a woolen spun yarn instead of a worsted spun. So woolen spun yarn would be lighter, a lighter wearing garment. It wouldn't be so heavy. It would also be warmer because it's trapping more air, but it wouldn't be as hard wearing or long lasting, as I've said, in heavy use. Also think about maybe the weight of the yarn. So if you can't find a 5-ply Gansey yarn that you would like to use, then maybe look at a 4-ply or a light DK weight yarn instead. So you can by all means experiment with different types of yarn and also with different fibres as well. So I tend to knit all my Ganseys with 100% wool yarns, but I have got an example which I'll show you with a original 1980s machine knitting yarn, which is an acrylic wool mix, so it's machine washable, and it's actually making up quite a nice garment in an authentic 1980s shade of colour as well. So you can play around with those. So this is the range of colours of Gansey, 5-ply Gansey yarn that's available from the main commercial supplier of Gansey yarns at the moment, although there's a number of companies that do produce a 5-ply Gansey yarn. Also think about the patterns that you're going to include. So I've shown you some of the motifs and patterns that are commonly included on Ganseys, but you might want to look at using some open work or lace motifs in the Gansey. Now these are quite traditional in Eriskay Ganseys more recently. So the Tree of Life motif on the left worked as an open work stitch, and then the horseshoe on the right. I think these wouldn't have been practical inclusions in a traditional working Gansey because they would have let in too much cold air and water. They wouldn't have preserved the weatherproofing and waterproofing properties of the garment. But as a decorative ornamented garment, these are great devices to include, particularly if you want to create something that is a bit more feminine. Sometimes a Gansey can look quite masculine. So if you wanted to feminize it a bit more, then you could include some more open work lace elements to give it a bit more elegance. And also you might want to try experimenting with your own motifs. So something I was playing around with earlier this year is a design based on the traditional Berlin, the Hebridean Berlin, a style of boat that was very traditional here in the Hebrides. So I played around with working a little motif that represents the Hebridean Berlin that would have been seen plying the waters of the Hebrides quite some time ago. So you can feel free to play around with your own motifs. And somebody I know here on the Hebrides has designed a open work, a lacework seagull motif, which is really effective. It's a really beautiful repeating seagull motif in an open work pattern. And then also reinterpretation, so you don't have to feel constrained to working Gansey patterns in a Gansey. So here's an example of a cowl which I designed. I designed the pattern as a kit for Uist wool, and this is a cowl just incorporating some of the common motifs from the Eriskay Ganseys. That's the fishing net bands and the Tree of Life. So you can reinterpret the traditional patterns into something that's modern and more wearable, and all sorts of different garments. And then here is just some examples where I've been playing around in really maybe straying a bit too far from the Gansey traditions, but on machine knitting, playing around here in the background image with some slip stitch patterns on the machine, using the Tree of Life as a repeating motif, and then taking some of the traditional Gansey motifs and using them for colour work, again on the knitting machine. So really straying quite far from the traditions of hand knit, knit and purl stitch patterns on a Gansey, but reinterpreting those motifs in a way that can be applied to other applications. And then finally, I'm just going to talk very briefly about the Eriskay herring pattern that's part of the shoal pattern that the museum have released. So I'll just talk to you a bit about swatching of the patterns, and then the pattern that I selected, and then some hints and tips for knitting it. So I'm just going to show you here. I started out by looking at some of the most commonly occurring patterns, motifs that are represented in Eriskay Ganseys, and I started off with the Tree of Life, fitting it into the existing shoal, the herring shoal pattern. So here you can see the tree of life, then I've just put it end to end onto the body of the fish. It worked quite well, but it didn't really distinctively say Eriskay to me. So my other favourite motif is one of the large motifs, is the snowflake starfish, and I fitted this into the pattern along with a couple of bands of the fishing net. But I felt this was, one, a bit too busy, and also the starfish motif is so large that the tips kind of meet at the top and bottom of the body, and you're kind of losing the effect of the starfish. The motif was too big to really fit the body. So I went back to my catalogue of Eriskay motifs to see what might else work. And I struck on the open work pattern of the horseshoe. So I worked up the horseshoe pattern there. But I didn't like the fact that the bottom and the top of the body just had this big bland bit of reverse stocking stitch, and I felt that the placement of the fishing net was too far forward to make the head too small. So I just adapted that and moved the fishing net back a bit so the head's a bit more in proportion. It's upside down. And then to deal with the big bland bits on the top and bottom, I've added in some of these slip over false cables on the top and the bottom to fill in some of that. So I was quite happy with that, so I worked it up in the white yarn as well just to check, and there we go. So I was quite pleased with that design. So that's really kind of how the design evolved, just by trying out, swatching lots of different ideas with the motifs that commonly occur in the Eriskay ganseys. And hints and tips in terms of working specifically the Eriskay version of that pattern. With all my swatches, I worked them on 2 DPNs, holding the stitches on 2 DPNs and working with a third. So I wasn't using any more than that. And I think I like to do it that way because you don't then end up with any kind of gapping where you're changing needles partway through the pattern. So having any gapping, if it does occur on the edges, on the top and bottom of the body, is going to be less obvious than if it's happening down the middle of the pattern. So if you are, happy working just with the stitches held on 2 needles, it can be a bit fiddly and a bit awkward, but once you get going, it's all right. Then I would recommend that. I would also recommend, just as with most Gansey patterns, selecting a lighter shade of yarn to show off the pattern. With darker colours of yarn, the relief of the pattern doesn't tend to show up so well. And then I particularly found with the Eriskay version, with this final Eriskay pattern, when you're stuffing it, with whatever stuffing you're using, I've just used some carded fleece. Just make sure you pack it well, because that then fills out the pattern properly. Because you've got these kind of effectively ribbing edges, there is a tendency there for that to draw in on the top and the bottom. So the way to avoid that is to really pack the stuffing in quite well, so it's quite well stuffed, and that makes sure that those kind of false ribs, false cables on the edge there aren't pulling it in and losing the shape too much. So give the fish a good stuffing. Okay, that really covers everything I had to say. I hope you've learned a little bit about the Eriskay tradition of Gansey knitting and how that fits within the wider context of Ganseys more generally. I think, Carolyn, have we got time for questions?
Yeah, we've